Ms. Gray, do you want to make introductions, please?
Thank you. Sue Gray, Community Development Business Manager. Today we are presenting the results of the Land Development Team Fee Study. We're going to kick it off with George Buell, and then we will have Eric Johnson give an overview of the findings, and then we have staff recommendations, Andrew Stuffler, the Chief Building Official, Renee Brooks, City Planner, Adam Hindle, Principal Engineer, and Rob Dayton, Transportation, Planning, and Parking Manager. So with that, I will turn it over to George.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, I'm George Buell, Community Development Director, and I'm proud to present with staff the results of our most recent fee study that we began essentially last year. The study was conducted by Mr. Eric Johnson with Revenue Cost Specialists. He's worked in numerous communities throughout the state of California, actually the country, on similar studies, and you'll hear more about that as we go on. But it's important to note that this fee study comes subsequent to a study that was conducted in 2004. Going 14, 15 years is an exceptionally long period of time between studies because, in essence, as again you'll hear, the basis for our fees is the amount of time that it takes to perform the service related to the various permits that we issue. And under law, we can't charge any more than it costs to provide that service. And so over time, processes change. Over time, codes change. And the review becomes different. Sometimes it becomes more simple. Other times it becomes more complicated. As things are, typically they become more complicated, and you'll hear more about that as we go on. Eric worked along with a group of staff, the managers of which are here, but this is just a small subset of the staff members that were consulted in this process. This study looked at staff from top to bottom, and the staff that are doing the lion's share of the work on all the various permits that we issue in the land development process. The recommendations, you'll see that in some cases we're looking to recommend that we bring down some of the fees, and in other cases we look that we'll be bringing them up. And without going into specific detail now, we definitely will for you later on, but I'm going to turn it over to Eric, who will now describe his involvement with the project, and then subsequently, as Sue mentioned, each of the respective managers that oversee the various divisions in the land development process. Thank you. Eric.
Great. Thank you, George. Good afternoon, Chair, members of the committee. Am I close enough here? I'm Eric Johnson from Revenue Cost Specialists, and so just wanted, as George mentioned, present what we did, why we did it, how we did it, just a broad overview of the study, and then, of course, staff will get into a little bit more detail. Before I do that, though, I just want to get a little background of Revenue Cost Specialists. We've been doing this since 1980, since basically the passage of Proposition 13 and Proposition 4, and when cities realized that cities were going to need to know this information, need to be able to keep track of this information like they never had before. And so we really pioneered the concept of matching fee revenue with the service cost. Done this for over 250 agencies in 5 states over the last almost 40 years. I myself have been doing this for over 29 years, almost 30 years, and I've worked in over 100 different agencies doing this very same thing. This is what we do. All right, so what did we do? We really took the city's budget and recast it as if it were a business. And so one of the main things of being a business, you're not going to stay in business very long if you don't know what it costs to provide services to your customers. And so that's the process that we went through here. And what does it cost to provide services? So you won't see a city council service. You won't see a city manager service. You won't see a community development administration service. You'll see the services that provide services to the public, to your customers. Now, all these other costs are certainly part of the cost, but they're more the indirect costs. And so everything is focused on what does it cost to provide services to your customers, to the public. We also matched up revenues to costs because, again, you're not going to stay in business very long if you don't match up the revenues coming in with the costs going out. So what did we do? How did we do it? We basically, as George touched on, we needed to identify how much time it took to provide all these services. So we started this last summer and had many somewhat grueling meetings sometimes with staff over the last 8 months, and started with what are the services being provided. Went through the fee schedule, the current fee schedule, and talked about are there areas that it needs to change? Are there areas that we could do it better with, still working within the code? Are there better ways to charge this than you're currently charging it now? And so we went through that process. Then we broke out what are the steps involved. And so every city has various similar services, but they all define it differently. Santa Barbara defines things much differently, as you probably know. And so it was really a unique animal. So it was really breaking down what are the steps. And the steps are similar every place you go. The applicant comes to the counter, you take it in, there's a process that it goes through. Once we defined those general steps, we then went through for every service, how much time does it take, who's involved. Then we came back and reviewed it again. We came back and reviewed it again. We add in how many of these do you do? And give us total time, so we make sure we're not over allocating staff, because we allocate out 100% of staff. Staff's doing something, whether it's providing service to the public that could be charged a fee, it's something that is provided to the public that maybe you can't charge a fee or don't want to charge a fee, and then there's the administrative support. There's various levels of administrative support within the department that help everybody else to be able to do their job. We then looked at the budget. We developed a fully burned hourly rate for every position. So people's actual salaries, benefits, general operating expenses within the department or division. And then we had department overhead, division overhead, and then city overhead from the city's cost allocation plan, where we've included the cost for city council, city manager, finance, HR, and those kinds of things. So we know how much time it takes. We know what the cost is per hour. And so we then merge those together to say, here's now what the cost to provide that service. We then sat down with staff again and said, okay, here's the cost, here's the current fee. Let's talk about how we want to change the fee to, in most cases, recover 100% of the cost. And we went through that process with them to make sure that the fee recommendations that are in the book are something that could be implemented that makes sense at the counter and only recover the cost. Because as George mentioned, under Proposition 4, you can't charge more than the cost reasonably borne of providing the service. Go ahead, next. Now, there's a difference between what we call community-supported services and personal choice services. Community-supported services, those things that taxes pay for, and they're really only taxes can pay for. And, police, fire, street maintenance, park maintenance, those things, when people say, what do I pay my taxes for? This is what they pay their taxes for. And so there are limited amounts of those within this study. We had code enforcement to the extent it's not covered by fines. We have some counter time. We have some city special project time. But most of the department is supported by fees. Now, but to the extent that the fees don't cover the cost, it's coming from taxes, because that's the only place it can come from. So that means you have less money to spend on cops and firefighters and maintenance workers, those things that only taxes can pay for. And then we define personal choice services, those things where the customer is identifiable, the service is measurable, it benefits a specific individual or group, and it's something you could reasonably charge a fee for. It's realistic to be able to charge a fee for. So obviously, all the services that we've listed in here, we've defined as personal choice services, and those things that you're either charging a fee or think it's realistic to be able to charge a fee. Next slide. Now, I'm kind of a picture person, and so the same thing is through pictures here. Taxes and grants pay for community-supported services. Fees pay for personal choice services. To the extent that the fees don't cover the cost, again, it can only come from taxes. So you got this leakage of tax dollars to support personal choice services. And we identified a little over $2 million in costs that we think could be supported through fees. Now, at the end of yeah.
Is that $2 million annually?
Annually,
Thank you.
yes. Now, at the end of the day, it's up to the city council to decide who pays for what. These costs are occurring. We've identified what the costs are. If the fee doesn't cover the costs, it's coming from taxes. And that means you have less money to spend on those things that taxes can pay for. So at the end of the day, this is a really tax subsidy decision. The end result are fee adjustments, but it really comes down to who's going to pay for the services that are being provided. And in most cases through this report, I've recommended 100% cost recovery to be able to show you what 100% cost recovery looks like. There are some, as staff will go through, some where they feel it should be subsidized for certain reasons. At the end of the day, it's up to the council to decide. You obviously can't charge more than the cost, but you can choose to subsidize certain services because there's a community benefit. You want to encourage someone to do something. There's many reasons to subsidize, but just keep in mind that you're using tax dollars to do so. And so just a kind of a summary of the breakout of the revenues and the costs. So engineering, transportation, the different planning divisions, building and safety. The revenue there is the current annual revenue based on the current fees. The cost are the costs we identified through this report of providing those services. And therefore, if it's a positive, it's a profit. We see a lot of negative numbers there, of course. So the end result is that negative $2 million, that $2 million subsidy you see at the bottom there, and a current percent cost recovery. Now, in the possible new revenue, that number is a lower number, and there's a couple of reasons for that. We identified a number of services that you may get once every 3, 4, 5 years. We don't want to project revenue for something you'll get that irregularly, and so we basically project zero revenue for those individual services, so that adds up to a good chunk. And also on the building and safety side, we're showing a subsidy, but I was trying to be more conservative on the projecting of revenue, so I kept the revenue projection negative in this case. But that's really just me being more conservative. I'd rather show that because building safety fees are a little bit more dynamic as far as the volume. What comes across the counter can change dramatically from year to year and can affect the revenues dramatically also. So it's really just me being more conservative on the revenue projections there. And then on the next slide, there was some staff recommendations to have certain fees subsidized, and so that shaved about $400,000 off of the possible new revenue, or about $400,000 in tax subsidy, and staff will go through the reasons for that and which services they would like to subsidize. And with that, unless there's any questions on kind of broad methodology before I turn it over to staff Okay. All right, then I'll turn it over to Andrew, and he'll talk about building and safety.
Hi, Mr. Chair, committee members. I'm Andrew Stuffler. I'm the building official for the city. As you saw, our numbers, our revenue from our fees is fairly high, about $4 million a year. Eric's correct. The types of applications and permits that come across our counter vary each year. That said, we do generally hit our revenue marks pretty well because our fees are fairly well in balance right now, grossly, but not specifically. So let me talk about a couple of ways that we're going to propose to alter the fees. Our building plan review right now, we calculate the overall time it's going to take to process a building permit application, issue the permit, and do the inspections. We get that value, we cut it in half. We ask customers to pay half of that up front for plan check and the other half for the building permit. Eric's methodology was more finite, so we estimated how much time we actually spend in plan check and issuance and how much time we spend in the field. And so that results in some different plan check fees. It's not always 50% of the whole overall building permit fee. So we'll have a plan review fee and a permit issuance fee that will be not exactly 50% like they are now. They'll be a little different. And that's going to be based on the different types of permits. So there's no real specific rule to it. Sue, could you go back? I just want to make sure I touched on the last two items. Also included in this is records management. We had Eric take a look at how much time we spend managing our records, and that's a process that's in transition from paper to digital. So you'll see one set of fees in the resolution that'll come to City Council, and it'll show you what looks like two very similar fees. One's for us taking paper in and imaging it, and the other is for us taking images in and storing them. So just be aware of that when you see it. It might look a little odd. So even though our overall revenue numbers are pretty consistent, what we found was that we are spending less time on commercial projects than we had estimated in 2004, and less time on tenant improvements. So those fees are going to decrease. However, we also found that on the average, right, these are all average scenarios, the residential projects are taking more of our time. So those fees are going to go up if we're going to recover 100% of those costs. I talked about the new construction plan check fee not being 50%. This last bullet is very significant. So Eric's company's methodology is to look at the average scenario. And as we all know, Santa Barbara is full of projects that are anything but average. So in a lot of ways, right? Quality of design and construction, but we also have our challenges in the community, right? Where we have people who are doing work without permit and using labor that isn't maybe a general contractor and taking a lot more of our time. So when we have people come in and they want to argue about plan checks and go beyond more than 3 rounds of plan review on the same correction, they're going to have to start paying for round 4 and round 5. That's going to be a reality if we go with these fees, because we tried to set the fee at what should be the total amount of time necessary for a qualified professional to prepare a document and for us to review it 3 times, 3 rounds of plan review.
I have a couple of questions just so I understand this. So the initial fee gets you up to 3 rounds, and currently if you go 4, 5, or 6, there's no additional fees, but it's not you're charging each round. The first 3 are part of the fee.
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct.
And then in this slide, it says building and staff recommendations for full cost except, but how come with the previous slide, housing wasn't included in that? If you go back to the previous slide, actually, or you want me to wait for my questions?
Maybe it's the next slide?
The building, or the next slide, I guess, the building trends.
I think it might be the next one, Sue.
Actually, that's the slide right there. It was that slide you just had up.
Okay.
Because you just went over that one. So my question is that with a fee decrease in the commercial and tenant improvements, because you indicated that it's a smaller percentage of the time, and residential is more, but the increase in residential, the issue, though, that we're dealing with is the cost to produce residential. And that directly has a correlation at some point, depending on the type of project and the scale, to, especially if we're dealing with apartments, what it rent at. So why was there a decision, or what's the rationale behind increasing the residential fee development and decreasing the commercial? Because I would think that if you're decreasing the commercial rate as well, you might be inducing more commercial development, which would then increase the more residential development that you need, because you're creating new jobs that are going to need new housing. So I'm just trying to see if any consideration was given to those two, and what your thinking behind those two was.
Yes, Mr. Chair, committee members. So you're out looking at the big picture, right? Which is great. This is very finite. So we're looking at the amount of time we estimate it takes us to conduct a residential series of building inspections on a typical residential building. The amount of time we think it should take us to do plan review of a residential building. So it's all based on our experience of how many hours we think that's going to take. And then that gets multiplied by the hourly rate, and it just is what it is. There's no consideration for, at this point in time, right? At this point in time, it's just these are the numbers that Eric has put together to show 100% cost recovery. And the reality was, based on our current fees, these new ones, the commercial are going to be lower and the residential are going to be higher. That's just the way the hourly estimates worked out. It wasn't a discretionary decision. That was just the math. When we go to the next slide, we can go to, we looked at in the past, what types of permits have we consciously said we're not going to recover 100% of our costs. And that I think is now getting into the discussion maybe that you were, or the thought process you were going through, which is, hey, if we increase the cost of permits for residential, we may be discouraging residential development, right? So we didn't step into that. We just looked at the fees that we in the past, City Council has approved a lower cost recovery than the total, and that's been for electric vehicle charging stations, festival wiring, and electrical generators for festivals. So the general, in the 5 years that I've been back here and the 5 years before when I was here in the 90s, the general idea was the festivals are great and we don't want to impede them from being safe and people having a good time. We issue very few of those permits, so the cost to us is very minimal. So let's keep those fees down low for generators and festival wiring. And then since the 90s, electric vehicle charging stations, it was determined that we should not charge full cost recovery for those because we want to encourage people to use electric vehicles. We think that's an environmentally friendly approach, and that was a decision that was made by City Council in the past. So that's why it's reflected here. If during the course of this fee study and the fee resolution, council decides, hey, we want to reduce the cost recovery on residential permits to bring it down to where it is now, from where Eric seems to think it should be based on our estimates. That's a political decision that can be made, right? It has a consequence, but that would be something that would happen when we bring the fee resolution to City Council.
It's just something that can't be done at the expense of commercial and TIs. You can't charge more for commercials and TIs because you want to subsidize residential. You can use tax dollars to subsidize residential, but you have, if we're showing that this is what it costs to process commercial and TI permit, you can't charge more than that.
Yeah, good point. We can't, it has to be what it is, and we have to acknowledge that we're going to subsidize it or not. Excuse me. We did consolidate. Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry, apologies. This isn't specific to building and safety, but perhaps you can answer it, or maybe. I'm curious whether any engagement with applicants for these services has been done. Do we have any idea whether moving to full cost recovery will lower the number of applications we see to these various services? Do we have? I'm trying to understand the knock-on effects of this, and is that not part of today's purview? I guess
I can respond to that if you like. So we sent out, I think in the staff report you'll see we sent out an email to our land development team group to vet this out with them so that we could answer any questions.
One response, is that what I read?
Yeah, we got one person. So here's what we've heard. We've heard in prior city council hearings, specifically the State Street hearings that we had last summer, fall, somewhere around there, that it really wasn't about the money. It's about the timeliness of the service and the predictability of approval. So to that extent, and the one person showing up after we let 400 and some people know, we don't hear that there's a problem with our fees being too high. We hear that the service level is not high enough.
Thank you. I just have one quick follow-up. To that point, I'm assuming with this move to full cost recovery, we won't see any improvement in service times or processing times because we're just recovering what we're already spending. Is that correct? We're not going to be able to allocate additional staff time to providing these services by spending more money, or will we? Can people expect to see an improvement in services if we do this?
Someone's going to pinch hit.
Yeah. Mr. Chair, members of the committee, I'd like to address that. And let me just make an important clarification. The building division, the fees that Andrew has been talking about to this point, they have been essentially full cost recovery for a long period of time. And so that's important to remember. Some of the fees are going up, other fees are going down, as was mentioned. But on balance, we've been at full cost recovery. So we're really not going to be changing with regards to the recovery rate. If there is a desire to change or improve the service level, that is possible, but it will result through bringing on of either contract staff or regular full-time staff. And that will have cost implications to the various permits. And so if you wanted to see some change in that regard, there would be a financial implication that could be factored in. And I think that addresses your question.
Yeah, I didn't mean specifically in connection with building and safety.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to call you out in that way. I just mean more generally. Perhaps it is a more relevant question in connection with planning or where we're seeing larger disparities in costs and what we were charging. Maybe
Yes.
Ms. Brooke can speak to that.
Yes, and that comment holds true across all the lines of the land development team process. If we needed better service in one division over another, we could bring in more staff, and that could be reflected in the fees.
Okay, sorry. I don't mean to belabor this point. I'm just trying to understand. So if we get to 100% full cost recovery on a planning fee, for example, that wouldn't necessarily mean that we would have sufficient revenue to bring in more folks. That would be another budgetary decision, right? What we're doing today is just getting us to zero.
This is a snapshot in time. This is what it costs today. So you're absolutely right. To increase the cost would, if we were passing through those costs, as I think we should, that would increase the fees.
Can I also add that it would, theoretically speaking, raising the planning fees to 100% or what staff recommends would mean that the general fund subsidy for planning that we've had will go down. So, but there can be a combination between that subsidy going down and other services being enhanced.
Just to be crystal clear, and again, I don't mean to belabor the point, but I understand, this is the first time you've heard something like this, and so I want to make sure that there's a clear understanding. If there is we can raise fees that will result in increased revenue that can provide the finances necessary to increase staff. Yeah.
Mr. Casey would like to enter the rotation.
I do. Because it's a very important point. And I want to make sure you kind of have your frame of context about what you're dealing with today. So today what you're looking at is a comprehensive fee study, a snapshot in time. How are we doing with the staffing we have and the fees that we charge? And are we at full cost recovery, or how much is the general fund subsidizing on the planning side? So you'll see that. As we go through, especially on the planning side, building and safety kind of staffing is what it is. You will see in our budget recommendation that we're going to recommend increasing staffing in building and safety, and then increase the fees a little bit to cover that new cost, because have a new total cost in the building and safety world, so you can increase fees slightly for that. So you'll see that through the budget presentation. The policy question you need to be thinking about when you get into the planning side is that the general fund has been subsidizing planning fees for years at a pretty substantial amount. You can choose to raise planning fees to reduce that subsidy. Does the general fund benefit by not having to subsidize fees more? Do you want to take some of that savings and increase planning staffing to expedite the process? That's the policy question that we'll have to work out with you as we go through. Yep.
And it also seems like some of the questions from my colleagues are directed towards cost sensitivity of the applicants. And if it does turn into a situation where fewer people apply for permits, that decreases the workload, which would increase potentially the quality and speed with which the service is delivered. And I agree 100%. The most common feedback I've been getting is we just need to get through the process faster, particularly in planning. So that would have that impact. I'm not suspecting that would be the outcome. I think there's several inputs into the cost of construction. The land costs, labor costs, design costs are all significantly more than the permitting costs. But that being said, obviously, legally and morally, we're not going to charge more than it costs us to deliver those services. And then it's up to the council as a policy-making body to decide just where that marker is on the percentage scale. Right. And do we want to subsidize certain types of construction over others? But that's not what we're looking at today. This just gives us that flexibility and opportunity down the line.
Mr. Chair, you're absolutely right. Every place I go, they may complain about the fees. No one wants to pay more. But at the end of the day, that's not what moves the needle. It's time. Time is money for them. They care about how fast it's being processed. They'll pay almost anything. There's many places I go where they charge double to do it quicker. They'll send it out to contract to do it quicker, and they'll pay that easily. It's about time.
Okay, so continuing. Thanks for the support from the director and city administrator. If you look at Appendix C to the staff report, pages 8 through 13 are individual, we call them miscellaneous fees, fee items. And you'll notice that some of them are stricken out. We went through and tried to consolidate the fees and just make them more simpler. There's no real crazy news story with this. It's just in some instances we were, permits for a door. We just don't have people come in and get a permit for a door. It's usually an alteration that's bigger than just getting a door. So if you see those in here and you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me and I can answer in more detail. But you'll notice that some of those are stricken. And I think we might have added a new fee or two. I don't know, Sue, do you recall if we added some? It seemed like we did. I can't remember which ones they were, though.
I created some new categories.
Yeah, to consolidate. So with that, I am done, and I think... Who is our next? Renee Brook, the city planner. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and committee members. I'm Renee Brook, city planner, and I'll briefly touch on some of the changes, the findings of the study as it relates to planning fees, and then our recommendations. Could you go back? just quickly to cover in the division, there's 4 sections. 3 of these sections that are listed up there are functions that provide services to which we charge fees. So what's not there is long range and special studies. So staff in that section is largely funded by the general fund and any grants that we receive. So development environmental review, those are the planners working largely on development projects that go to the Planning Commission and the staff hearing officer. Design review and historic preservation work really closely with our design review boards. And zoning and enforcement are staff working the counter, doing zoning plan check, and responding to requests for information about properties. So those are in a nutshell, the services we provide. So when we were working with Eric in all those really fun meetings, walking through every application type and how much time staff spends from beginning to end through project review, we also really tried to focus on simplifying and collapsing our fees, because we had found over time we kept generating these additional categories to our fees to try to just fine tune the fee based on the size of house or the size of the commercial tenant improvement. And when we got down to it, we found that unless there was a really big discrepancy in the project description, we didn't spend a whole lot more time on a 15-unit housing project than we did on a 4-unit housing project. So we really tried to collapse those fees, obviously through doing that, making them much more reflective of actual time spent. I don't know that it was mentioned, it was shown in an earlier slide, that for many years the planning division services were largely subsidized by the general fund, somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 to 60%. With our latest study, the results are that we're recovering about 60 to 80% of our costs now, depending on the service provided, but still well below full cost recovery. So most fees are significantly below full cost, and that's been a policy decision by City Council up to this point, to subsidize those services that in large part provide a benefit to the greater community, our design review process and development review process. But as Eric's recommending, we recommend, for the most part, moving toward full cost recovery, with some exceptions. And I'll walk through some examples of those exceptions on the next slide. One area where we believe provides a greater community benefit, even beyond the project applicant that might be needing to provide a historic structure or site report for a development project, is through that research and that conclusion of that report. What comes of that report can be a great benefit to the community, because sometimes it might be a recommendation to designate the structure a city landmark. And then we follow through that process and eventually get, through Historic Landmarks Commission and City Council to designate that property. So while the property owner is paying for that report, there is a greater community benefit to the findings of that report. So we'd recommend subsidizing the cost of that report. Then there's a couple services where we want to encourage participation. For the pre-application review team, there are some applications that are required to go through that process. There is an ability for an applicant to voluntarily do it, though, and we want to continue to encourage that, because it really helps vet any major issues that a project might face through the land development review process. And oftentimes, applicants or prospective property owners will go through that if they're looking to purchase a piece of property or propose a development, and then they realize this isn't the right place for this project. So we want to encourage that. Mills Act program, we were just here before you a couple weeks ago to talk about that. The application fee itself, we'd like to maintain fairly accessible to people. We would recommend charging full cost recovery once somebody's accepted into the program, the contract processing and the follow-up. And then in terms of minimizing government constraint, there's a certain category of coastal development permits that don't require public hearing. That's a roundabout way of saying accessory dwelling units in the coastal zone, because it's really the only type of development in the coastal zone that in some cases requires a coastal development permit but not a public hearing. It's just a nuance in the two state laws, the Coastal Act and then the recent legislation for accessory dwelling units. The actual time for staff to process those results in a fairly significant fee, but in order to encourage more granny flats and those types of housing units, we'd recommend subsidizing that fee. Also for appeals, they've long been subsidized by the general fund. The fee for those, we'd recommend keeping those accessible to members of the community. And then minor zoning exception administrative review is, it's just an odd nuance in the fact that we have two different titles, two zoning ordinances in effect in the city. We have Title 28 in the coastal zone and Title 30 in the inland areas of the city. We have two different review processes when an applicant wants to request a minor zoning exception, and based on that review process, it takes more time to process them in the coastal zone. We want to make those fees the same to the applicant so they're not paying the price for the fact that we have two different zoning ordinances applying to them in their development. And then there are some fees that would be increasing fairly significantly, and in those cases we'd recommend increasing them over a 3-year period. And we used a threshold, twofold threshold. If the fee was going to result in over a 50% increase and a $2,500 increase, that was the threshold we used to identify those fees that would be adjusted over 3 years. And then we're also changing how we collect fees, similar to what Mr. Stuffler was saying about collecting some fees at the outset and then later when the building permit was issued. We have for a long time collected a portion of the planning division fees up front for the larger projects that go through the development application review team process. There's an initial fee collected, and then if the project was seen through and approved, and at the time they applied for a building permit, we would collect another 30% of all the fees that had previously been collected. So in some cases, we are providing the service all the way through project approval, but if that project never actually got built, we were actually not collecting that additional 30% to recover our staff time. So we'd recommend collecting that all up front when the service is provided. So with that change, the fees would also go up because the fees listed in the fee resolution today don't have that 30% added onto it. It's just a single line item in the fee resolution that says, well, for these certain projects, you will also collect another 30% in fees at the time of building permit application. And I think that's it. Happy to answer any questions unless you want to hear the rest of the presentation.
Could you please go back to slide 20? I didn't follow the 3 bullet points, the minimize government constraint, particularly appeals. What was the change in policy there, or the change in fees? Or are you just maintaining it below cost?
Mr. Chair, our recommendation would be to maintain it below cost. The recommendation is to increase the fees by 30% over today's fees, but to still keep them highly subsidized by the general fund. Because, for example, the cost to process an appeal to City Council takes about $10,000 in staff time. To charge full cost recovery for that would be could be seen as unreasonable to a typical homeowner being able to afford that fee.
And the CDP?
That was specific to accessory dwelling units.
And the idea is to
facilitate that type of housing and to not have an additional government constraint towards production of that type of housing.
And so why would we treat that differently in the coastal zone? Or is that bringing it up to Title 30?
Right. So accessory dwelling units processed under Title 30 in the inland portion of the cities, in the inland portion of the city pays fairly low fees. But those in the coastal zone, because many of them require a coastal development permit, it could be $4,000 to $5,000 in just planning fees. So we'd recommend reducing that down to be a little more commensurate with what someone pays in the inland area.
And it seems like those developments would probably be just on a bigger scale overall. Property's probably worth more. Maybe they're doing it for commercial residential purposes. So what's kind of the underlying justification for not having equivalent cost recovery?
Well, to some extent, because in the recent legislation streamlining the process for accessory dwelling units, the state Housing and Community Development Office is looking pretty critically at communities that might put up any government barrier for the production of accessory dwelling units. So we're being cautious about our fees that we charge for those.
So is your concern if we're charging, I don't know, 50% to both categories, that's going to be seen as discriminating against coastal commission properties?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Why would the Coastal Commission look askance at a policy that has the same percentage cost recovery whether you're in or out of the coastal zone? You're treating everyone equally.
Well, it's because accessory dwelling units in the coastal zone still need to go through a coastal review process that others in the inland area are not subject to, and that's just the fact that the Coastal Act exists. Our process to hear those coastal development permits at the staff hearing officer takes more time than it does to process an accessory dwelling unit in the inland area that doesn't need to go to hearing at all. So it's just a matter of staff time.
Right, and I understand that part. So if the Coastal Commission was concerned about that, maybe they could cut down on the the red tape rather than having us reduce our cost recovery. I'm just thinking out loud in response to...
Because it's not the Coastal Commission that has the problem with the fee. It's more the state fees related to the new accessory dwelling units that more concerned about that. So I don't think the Coastal Commission factors into the kind of fee recovery or them saying you should charge less or anything like that.
Right. We haven't heard from the Coastal Commission staff about our accessory dwelling unit fees. I couldn't speak for them, but just the fact that the two laws still stand together. The accessory dwelling unit law did not supersede the Coastal Act, and in fact, it says that it explicitly does not. So we still have to process those developments under the Coastal Act and our local coastal program.
Okay. Well, I guess my inclination would be to leave the same percent recovery whether you're in the coastal zone or not.
Okay.
Even if you have to go through more steps in the coastal zone, I think that's something we should make sure they're aware of that and they can proceed on that basis. But otherwise, it's almost like we're subsidizing it. I know we're not, depending on how you view the government, the general fund money that comes in, and then the coast and the minor zoning exception with the administrative review.
That, again, is a holdover because we have the two different zoning ordinances. So I believe it was in about 2015, we established the minor zoning exceptions for fences, walls, and hedges where staff could, it was considered a category lower than a modification. So rather than having to go to the staff hearing officer for a modification, if someone wanted to exceed the allowed hedge or fence or wall height, they could have a staff level decision if certain findings could be made in certain situations. So we established minor zoning exception. That was when we had Title 28 in effect throughout the city, and those are decided by staff. When we amended the regulations through Title 30, we now refer those to the design review board. So rather than staff making those determinations, they go largely to the single family design board, and then they make that decision on whether or not an exception should be made. And it turns out that process is faster to go to the design review board for that decision than it is for staff to make that decision. So it's just a disparity of having the two different zoning ordinances in effect in the coastal zone and the inland area. So for the exact same request, someone in the coastal zone would be paying more for that because we have this older process in place. So we were recommending making those fees the same.
Great, thank you.
It looks like the mic was off here. So the mic's now on. So a few things I wanted to highlight directly from the fees. Some of our public works inspection fees are going up, and kind of on gross, maybe about 30% for public works inspection. This would be for something like a sidewalk inspection or a traffic control inspection related to a utility company. And then we also have valuation-based fees, which are a percentage of the construction cost. So somebody's going through a public improvement, and our plan check fees are a percentage of that cost of construction. And on smaller projects, less than $50,000, we're seeing a slight increase in those fees to fully recover costs. And then on larger projects, it's more status quo. So we're not making changes when projects are larger, because we're just going to try to recover our costs. And then a few items we're recommending deposit-based fees for. These are really only applications that we don't process very often. Maybe they come up once every couple years. So rather than going through the exercise of coming up with a lump sum fee, we have a recommended deposit amount where the applicant gives us a deposit, and we draw down on that deposit to provide the service. So next slide. Okay. So fees that we're recommending below cost. As I mentioned before, residential use, we process parking restriction waivers. So somebody's at their house and they need to bring in a storage pod to store some stuff in front of their house for a week. And that's called a parking restriction waiver. And that's a fee item that we're recommending subsidizing to keep that affordable, make sure that people come in to us and apply, make sure our streets are safe. And then encouraging participation. Some of those examples of those elements would be non-recorded encroachment permits, again, just wanting to get people in to apply with us so that we can review and comment. And then city easements. So we process easements for city assets on private property. So we might have a development project or a residential project where there's a sewer main or a water main going across their property, and we need to process the real property documents, easements, and such. Because the city is getting a benefit from the landowner and they're granting us an easement, we think it's appropriate to subsidize the staff costs involved to process those. And then over-the-counter traffic control permits. These are things when somebody's setting up some traffic control on the street for a couple days, not an extensive plan. We just want them to come in and apply for us, so we recommend subsidizing that. And then the last item I wanted to go over was related to reducing government constraint. My staff processes address assignment letters. So the United States Post Office does not assign addresses. The city assigns addresses. And so occasionally somebody will have a property where they 20 years ago got approved for a duplex and they never got a second mailbox. They just have one address. And they have a new tenant that wants a mailbox. And so we have to review that and issue an address letter so that the post office knows that it's a valid address. And that's something that we see as a basic government service of mail delivery. And so we recommend subsidizing that processing fee. And with that, I think that ends my presentation. Questions?
Any questions? We don't want Public Works Engineering to feel any less glamorous than the other departments. Thank you, Adam.
Okay, you're welcome.
It's okay.
We're okay with less glamorous. So I'm Rob Dayton, and so in Public Works, we have the engineering side and the transportation side of land development. So this is the transportation side of the land development. And we do a couple things. We do plan checks for sites that are coming in. Do they have the appropriate access, maneuverability for vehicles, appropriate access to the adjacent roadway, pedestrians, cyclists, sometimes transit. And then transportation review of the site, make sure it's going to be okay for access in terms of safety in the public right-of-way. We work with actually Derek Bailey quite a bit on that. And then transportation analysis. Is the development meet the city's standard for level of service as it goes in, or will it trigger an impact? So those are the three things that we're looking at. We have fee recommendations for full cost recovery. It's kind of interesting. During the last recession, the two full-time FTEs in land development, transportation were general fund, and during the last recession, it's been switched to Measure A. So any money we do not recover, any money we don't recover within this process is spent. Measure A monies are spent. Measure A is generally for road maintenance purposes. So we're recommending full cost recovery for the transportation building plan check fee, transportation supplemental review, miscellaneous reviews, any on-site parking agreement that we have to arrange. In that case, a developer proposes to put their parking on a different site, and then we have to tie the two properties together. Parking design waiver, very, very common, that a development, particularly those that are existing non-conforming, don't want to meet a specific standard by inches or feet, and then we can accommodate a waiver if it's appropriate. And then a parking modification for demand analysis is when a developer comes in and they say, I don't want to provide the ordinance requirement, the parking ordinance requirement, which is administered by planning upstairs. I would like to do the demand, which sometimes is less. And so we'll do a demand analysis. A lot of times there's shared use as a combination of that. And that is also a fee that we charge for that. And then lastly, fees that we do, the trip generation analysis is if we think there's going to be an impact to the adjacent street, a level of service, congestion increase, then we'll do a trip generation analysis. We'll ask for a fee. How many trips is this development going to do? And then how is that review going to affect the adjacent roadway? So we have a modeling run that we do or do not do that has a fee attached to it. And then we have to manage that contract. So the traffic generation analysis review is for a consultant, and then that transportation consultant contract management is our management of the contract. It's a percentage of the total. And then the preliminary transportation plan review, is the plan ready to go under the building permit process? And that's all our fees. Any questions?
So there's nothing that you're lowering costs on, or no good news?
No good news.
I think that's why you front-loaded your slide with 16 emoticons. Mr. Hendel, take note.
That must be the reason. Yeah, that must be the reason. Thank you for that.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Dayton.
So with that, Mr. Chair, we're asking that the Finance Committee provide direction regarding the staff recommendations to Council for the fiscal year 2020 fee adjustments.
And are you looking for a general high-level recommendation? Do you want it more categorical or sub-departmental?
I think what we are hoping is for... what are we hoping for? We are hoping for recommendations to Council. We are scheduled to go on April 23rd, and at that time, we would like Council to either give very, very specific direction regarding fees or to approve them as they're recommended.
Mr. Buell?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, I do want to reiterate what Sue just mentioned with respect to the feedback we're looking to get from you. The essence of the presentation is in this attachment that you have in your packet today. And we have presented to you in broad terms the big changes as we see them. A lot of them relate to the policy recommendations where we believe that general fund subsidy is appropriate. We heard some questions with regards to those. And so what we're looking for is your endorsement of this attachment, which would be subsequently included in our budget presentation or our budget package as we move forward in the budget hearings. Ours will take place on May 15th.
Okay, thank you. So do we, at this point, let me open it up to public comment. Is there any member of the public who would like to speak? Come on up. As long as you push the button on the mic, we'll accept your introduction.
Good afternoon. My name is Krista Pleiser. I'm the Government Affairs Director for the Santa Barbara Association of Realtors. And insofar as fees, I just want to kind of go high level in the standpoints of, remember that not all of these projects that you're talking about are these huge developments, developers coming in and making multi-units and all of that. Sometimes they're just regular homeowners that are going to come in and they want to like do a remodel, or they want to add something, or they want to change something on their property. And to have the fees go up within certain parameters could potentially create a situation where then they're not getting permits for these things, which is what we're hoping. And so just kind of keep that in mind when you are making decisions on the fee resolutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Pleiser. No other public is stepping forward, so we'll close public comment. Does anyone have a motion or recommendation they'd like to start?
Well, I'll start off. Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the presentation and the comments, Ms. Pleiser. I appreciate that. I'll be somewhat brief. I'm actually supportive generally of the fees as it's proposed. However, there are some questions that were more high-level policy issues, especially as it relates to housing. So I would move that we forward these to council. I'm not prepared today to make the recommendation to approve them. I think we have to have that full discussion at the council. But my colleagues think otherwise, I could support it. But I'd like to forward this to council for the recommendation, and then also just from my perspective, looking at in particular housing, when we look at whether or not to subsidize any from the general fund. If we could have a discussion or at least have some information presented on the possibility of any housing that has inclusionary in it, because I think that's a community benefit that would qualify under the others that we're looking at. The other issue is just in general, when it comes to council, better understanding of with these fees, what kind of services, the enhancement of the services could we be looking at? I know that's going to come during the budget, but if we could at least talk about that, because I think we had those questions today, so it's natural that the rest of the council is going to have that as well. So I'll move that we forward this to council for consideration.
Do we have a second?
I will second that.
Okay. Any more discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Okay, that passes unanimously. Anything else from staff? Okay, this meeting's adjourned. Thank you.